Section 3 of The Making of the British Empire by Arthur Hassel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 3. The Ministries of Wilmington and Henry Pelham, 1742 to 1754. On his retirement from office, Walpole left the Hanoverian dynasty firmly established on the throne, and the system of government by party ministries, depending on parliamentary majorities, finally consolidated. Though he retired to the House of Lords as the Earl of Orford, his influence continued to make itself felt till his death in 1745. No great changes were made in the administration. Lord Wilmington, Sir Spencer Compton, a mere nonentity, but a man much liked by the king, became titular Prime Minister and First Lord of the Treasury. The able but volatile Carteret succeeded Harrington as one of the two Secretaries of State, the weak and pliable Duke of Newcastle keeping his place as the other Secretary. No Tories received any appointments. Of the other Whigs who had lately been in opposition, Lord Chesterfield and Pitt were excluded from the government, and Pulteney, who had been chiefly instrumental in bringing about Walpole's fall, withdrew into the House of Lords as Lord Bath, and refused to hold any office, though retaining a place in the cabinet. The Whig factions had thus temporarily coalesced under the nominal leadership of Wilmington, and the first act of the government was to institute an inquiry into the conduct of Walpole. After about a year the investigation fell to the ground, it being found that most of the charges against the late administrators were not of a serious character. No real change was made either in home or foreign policy by the new ministry, the leading members of which were Carteret, Newcastle, and his brother Henry Pelham. From this time that disintegration of the Whig party began, which 20 years later was to enable George III to restore real authority to the crown. The government found itself called upon to deal with a variety of problems which henceforward required solution. Up till 1763, Europe was engaged in an endeavour to settle the questions which forced themselves into prominence between 1715 and 1740. Was the British or the French element to be supreme in North America? Were the French or the English to control the destinies of India? Was Prussia or Austria to enjoy the headship of the German states? These questions were in great part decided at the close of the 7 Years' War, when Prussia was recognized as the equal of Austria, and England's supremacy in North America and India were assured. Into the European struggle Carteret, who managed foreign affairs, threw himself with great energy. A skilled diplomatist with a great knowledge of foreign tongues and foreign politics, he sympathized with the king's Hanoverian tendencies, and a vigorous continental policy was adopted. The army and navy were increased. 16,000 British troops were landed in the Low Countries. A number of Hanoverians were taken into our pay, and the Dutch also prepared to support England. The war, from being a struggle over the Pragmatic Sanction, seemed likely to develop into a contest in which all Europe would be engaged. Like Walpole, Carteret insisted on the necessity of Austria accepting the loss of Silesia, and Maria Theresa with great reluctance consented in June to sign the preliminaries of Breslau with Frederick the Great. On July 28, 1742, the Treaty of Berlin was concluded. Frederick's possession of Silesia was secured, and Maria Theresa was left free to devote all her energies and resources to combating the French, Bavarians, and Spaniards. In this task the assistance given by the English proved most valuable. Admiral Matthews, who had forced Charles, the Spanish king of Naples, Don Carlos, to neutrality, was supreme in the Mediterranean, and supported the king of Sardinia. Meanwhile the Anglo-Hanoverian army in Flanders, under Lord Stair, taking advantage of the disasters to the French armies in Bohemia, advanced in 1743 into southern Germany in order to drive the French over the Rhine and crush Bavaria. In May, Stair was joined by an Austrian force, and when the French tried to cut off his communication with the north, he turned to force his way through them. On July 27th, the Battle of Dettingen was fought, the last fight in which a king of England ever took part. In the fierce struggle, George II. Showed considerable personal bravery. The French under Noailles, being defeated, retired into France. The results of this victory were considerable. Germany was cleared of the French troops. The Bavarian Emperor, Charles VII., was forced to take up a neutral position, and negotiations for peace were undertaken by George II. And Carteret. In July, Wilmington died, and owing to the influence of Lord Orford, Walpole, Henry Pelham succeeded to the position of Prime Minister. Carteret, however, still continued to direct foreign affairs and endeavoured to unite Europe against France. But while George II. And Carteret took a German view of the situation, proposing not only to preserve the Austrian alliance, but also to support the Emperor and to recover for him his Bavarian lands, the people of England, objecting to the use of Hanoverian troops in Germany and to all arrangements with the Emperor, demanded that if the war was continued, all the resources of the country should be concentrated upon the naval struggle with France. The war was no longer waged for the preservation of Austria, but had now for its object the crushing of France, and many thought that England might withdraw from operations on the continent. The alleged subordination of British to Hanoverian interests, the king's determination to pay the Hanoverian troops in time of war with English money, and his disposition to use the resources of Britain on behalf of his electorate, all tended to make the war and Carteret, its chief supporter, unpopular. On September 13th, 1743, the Treaty of Worms was signed by England, Austria, Holland, Saxony, and Sardinia, with the object of preserving the Pragmatic Sanction and the integrity of the Austrian dominions in Germany and Italy. France and Spain replied on October 25th with the Treaty of Fontainebleau, or the Second Family Compact, as it is sometimes called. Early in 1744, France declared war upon England and Austria. Until 1748 the issues were plain, and the contest assumed an intelligible form. Thus for 5 more years the war continued, being waged not only on the sea, but also in Italy, on the Rhine, and in the Netherlands. The years 1744 and 1745, however, saw further developments of the struggle both in Germany and in Great Britain. Frederick the Great suspected that the Austrians were planning the recovery of Silesia. He dreaded the covert hostility of George II. As Elector of Hanover, and moreover he was convinced that the Habsburgs meditated the permanent occupation of Bavaria. He resolved to defend not only his own conquests in Silesia, but also the rights of the Empire. On April 5th, 1744, with the support of the French, he formed the League of Frankfurt, which, though not joined by many German princes, enabled Prussia to pose as the defender of the rights of the Emperor and the Empire. In June a treaty was made between Louis XV. And Frederick the Great, and shortly afterward the Second Silesian War began and continued till December 25th, 1745, when Austria, by the Treaty of Dresden, was again forced to recognize her inability to reconquer Silesia. During the struggle the Bavarian Emperor, Charles VII., died, January 20th, 1745, and Austria agreed to forego her intention of seizing his dominions. One result of this renewal of hostilities between Maria Theresa and Frederick the Great was the withdrawal of Austrian troops from Alsace. A projected French invasion of England on behalf of the Pretender early in 1744 had been frustrated mainly by the tempestuous winds, but on May 11th, 1745, owing to the inaction of the Dutch contingent, the combined Anglo-Hanoverian forces were defeated at Fontenoy. During these years important changes had taken place in the personnel of the government. Carteret, identified with the unpopular Hanoverian policy, had been estranged from his colleagues, to whom his arrogance and his close relations with the king were not acceptable. In November 1744 he, Lord Winchelsea, and others left the government, and Henry Pelham was enabled to carry out considerable changes. Harrington succeeded Carteret. Chesterfield became Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. Lord Gower, a Tory, became Privy Seal. Grenville, Henry Fox, Bedford, Grafton, and the Jacobite Sir John Cotton received offices, and thus what is known as the Broad Bottom administration was formed. In spite of the denunciation of Carteret's policy, in which he had indulged, Henry Pelham found himself compelled to carry on the policy of introducing German troops, and to defend English interests against the energetic French policy in Flanders and in Scotland. James, the elder Pretender, was still alive, but he was an old man, and his bold and active son, Charles Edward, was now leading the Jacobites. Though the French army of invasion had been dispersed, the young prince resolved to try his fortune in Scotland. He slipped off to sea and reached Loch Moidart in the Western Highlands with but a single ship and 7 companions. The chiefs of the western clans, the Stuarts, Macdonalds, and Camerons, to whom he appealed for aid, were aghast at his rashness and besought him to return to France. But his fiery appeals to their loyalty induced them to throw prudence to the winds. His standard was hoisted at Glenfinnan on August 19, 1745, and a small but gallant army gathered around it. There were but a few regiments of regular troops in Scotland, commanded by Sir John Cope, a slow and timid general. While he was vainly seeking to hunt down the prince, the latter slipped southward and got between the capital and his enemy. He occupied Edinburgh, though the veteran George Preston held the castle for the government, and on September 21st the wild rush of his Highlanders scattered Sir John Cope's small army and won the Battle of Prestonpans. In November, at the head of 5,000 men, he marched into England and reached Derby. But the English population, while entirely indifferent to the House of Hanover, had for the most part lost all feeling of loyalty toward the Stuarts. They remained apathetic and showed no signs of any intention of risking their lives or property for the cause of the Pretender. The neutrality of the English population, combined with the approach of the armies of Wade and Cumberland, who had been recalled from Flanders, while another force gathered on Finchley Common for the protection of London, decided the military advisers of Charles Edward to counsel a retreat. After a halt at Glasgow, the Jacobites, now numbering 9,000, won the Battle of Falkirk on January 17, 1746. But they were compelled to retreat northwards, and at last totally defeated on April 16th at Culloden Moor near Inverness by the Duke of Cumberland. The rebellion was cruelly suppressed, and after many romantic adventures and hairbreadth escapes, Charles Edward sailed from Scotland to France on September 20th. His escape was entirely due to the loyalty of the Highland population to his cause, and the heroism of Flora Macdonald and other less famous partisans of his house. The rising had never had much chance of success. No French support was available, while in Scotland the city of Glasgow was Hanoverian, and opinion in the Lowlands was divided. Only in the Highlands could Charles Edward find loyal assistance, and the Highlanders, numbering only 1/12 of the Scottish population, were devoid of discipline, and showed a fatal propensity to return to their homes after a victory with the plunder they had gained. Had it not been for the incapacity of the military authorities in England, the Pretender's cause would have collapsed in 1745. During this rebellion, in which the government, as in 1715, received little active support from the English people, a ministerial crisis had occurred. Carteret, now Lord Granville, and Bath still had great influence with the king, and the Pelhams found their position untenable. They therefore demanded the admission of Pitt into the government, and upon the king's refusal the ministry in 1746 resigned. Granville and Bath found themselves unable to form a government, and George was compelled to restore the Pelham administration, and had to consent to Pitt receiving the lucrative office of Vice Treasurer of Ireland, and later that of Paymaster to the Forces. Till the accession of George III, the Whig oligarchy enjoyed undisturbed the possession of political power. During the years 1746 and 1747, the French, though unsuccessful in Italy, not only held their own in Flanders, but practically occupied the whole country. The English and Dutch were defeated by Marshal Saxe at the battles of Rocou and Lauffeld. Bergen op Zoom, the bulwark of Holland to the south, was taken, and Maestricht, her eastern stronghold, was besieged. With the exception of Anson's voyages round Cape Horn, the doings of the English commanders both on land and sea during Pelham's administration displayed naught but incapacity. The superiority of the English over the French fleets had been asserted, and in 1745 Cape Breton Island was captured. Though at the request of the Allies 30,000 Russians were marching across Europe, England and Holland were anxious for peace. The French, being deprived of the assistance of the young Elector of Bavaria, who had made the Treaty of Füssen in 1745 with Austria, and of Frederick of Prussia, who had signed on his own account the Treaty of Dresden in December 1745, and having moreover no fleet, were also ready to negotiate. Chesterfield, who had succeeded Harrington as Secretary of State, and Puiseux, the French Foreign Minister, both desired a cessation of hostilities. On April 30th, 1748, the preliminaries of the Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle were signed, Austria protesting against the action of England. To the influence of England, Maria Theresa attributed her loss of Silesia to Frederick the Great, and her cession of Lombard territory to Sardinia at the Treaty of Worms. She now found herself compelled to give more Italian territory to Charles Emmanuel, and made energetic attempts to win over the French and to shake herself free from England. But her efforts failed, and in October and November all the great powers agreed to the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. Don Philip, the second son of the Spanish Queen, Elizabeth Farnese, received Parma, Piacenza, and Guastalla. The King of Sardinia was given more Milanese territory. Prussia was secured in the possession of Silesia, and, accepting the Austrian cessions to Prussia and Sardinia, the integrity of the Pragmatic Sanction was assured. England and France agreed to a mutual restoration of conquests. By this agreement the English gave up Cape Breton, while the French restored several English factories in India which they had captured. For the war in the Far East had gone badly for England. A great French adventurer named Dupleix had raised the first army of disciplined and drilled native troops or sepoys, and by their aid had beaten the English and taken Madras, their chief settlement. He had also made vassals of the Nawabs of the Deccan and the Carnatic, the two chief princes of southern India. Hence the peace came as a crowning mercy to the English in the East, and checked Dupleix's scheme for driving them entirely out of the land. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, the great work of the Pelham ministry, proved to be merely a truce. The disputes between England and France and North America and India remained undecided, and Austria was by no means reconciled to the loss of Silesia. Maria Theresa was moreover furious at the conduct of England, and was already anxious to ally herself with France. For 8 years, however, Europe was to enjoy an uneasy period of peace until the outbreak of the 7 Years' War, which secured England supremacy in America and India, and the possession of Silesia to Frederick the Great. During the Austrian Succession War, domestic affairs had remained in the background. In October 1745 Sir F. Dashwood had indeed moved an amendment to the address, claiming for the people the right to be freely and fairly represented in Parliament. But no serious attempt was made to bring the House of Commons more into harmony with the mass of the nation. After the suppression of the Jacobite rebellion, the Highlanders were disarmed, and the chiefs were deprived of their hereditary jurisdictions, for which compensation was given. After the close of the Austrian Succession War, political rivalries for a time ceased. Several Tories were given places in the government, and Pelham was enabled to carry out many useful measures. The interest on the national debt was in 1749 reduced from 5 to 3%, and a consolidation scheme was introduced to the great benefit of the nation. In 1751 the Prince of Wales and Bolingbroke died. The former left a widow, Augusta of Saxe-Coburg, and a son, who, born in 1738, became George III. Bolingbroke had lived to see the Hanoverian dynasty firmly established on the throne, and the colonial policy which he had initiated continued with success by Walpole and Pelham. In 1752, through the influence of Lord Chesterfield, who had left the ministry in 1747, the calendar was reformed. England had hitherto adopted the Julian reckoning, which was incorrect, and in 1752 the English calendar was 11 days behind the Gregorian and correct calendar. Accordingly, in September 1752, 11 days were suppressed, and the cause of much confusion was removed, not without some protests by ignorant mobs who cried, "Give us back our 11 days." The following year a useful marriage act to prevent clandestine marriages was introduced by Lord Hardwicke, which provided that, with the exception of Quaker and Jewish marriages, no wedlock would be legal unless the persons concerned had complied with certain formalities or had been married by a clergyman of the Church of England. The same year a bill for the naturalization of the Jews was passed, but though in most matters the nation was lethargic, all questions which implied religious toleration almost invariably aroused popular opposition. The outcry against this measure was so great that in the following session the bill was repealed. Much distress having been caused by the large reduction in the army and navy after 1748, a system of emigration was inaugurated and proved eminently successful. About 4,000 colonists sailed to America, and Halifax was founded. In 1754 Henry Pelham died. Honest, businesslike, and conciliatory, he had inspired universal confidence. His ministry, in no sense brilliant, saw many useful measures passed, and the interests of England safeguarded abroad and developed at home. But Parliament was corrupt and did not represent the nation, while the executive was dominated by an increasing interest in commercial and financial questions. In very few periods of English political history, writes Mr. Lecky, was the commercial element more conspicuous in administration. In spite, however, of the absence of high political aims and of legislative measures for checking parliamentary corruption, the strong ministry of the Pelhams, synchronized with the gradual reawakening of the English people to the possibility of moral development side by side with material prosperity. The years from 1743 to 1754 form a period of preparation for the moral and intellectual revival which owes its beginning to the Wesleys and Whitefield, for the outbreak of national enthusiasm which was aroused by Pitt, and for the Industrial Revolution, which led to very striking changes in England during the reign of George III. Of these, the great Methodist movement, which had begun in 1738 with the return of John Wesley from his missionary visit to Georgia, was a reaction against that decline of religious feeling which characterized the age, and which was due in some measure to the policy of Walpole and the Whig governments towards the Church. Political appointments to high ecclesiastical posts resulted in non-resident bishops, a careless and unspiritual clergy, and a low moral tone among the laity. Literature and the drama suffered, political corruption increased, the poor were neglected, atheism and agnosticism grew. The reaction which John Wesley and George Whitefield headed led to the development of spirituality among the clergy, and prepared the way for that outburst of patriotism and for that recognition of the need of a higher political morality which are associated with the name of William Pitt. End of Section 3.